Hello and welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. I'm your host and producer, Danielle Terciano, welcoming you to join me on another dive into pop culture's past and present. Today, I'm joined by journalist and author Kristen Lopez, whose latest book, Popcorn Disabilities: The Highs and Lows of Disabled Representation in the Movies, comes out on November 27th. Kristen is here to talk about writing the book, of course, but also one of her big influences that happens to warrant a lot of examination within the book as well. There will be some spoilers ahead, as always, but let's just get right into it. First of all, Kristen, thank you, of course, for coming on.
Thank you for wanting to hang out with me. I always appreciate anybody that lets me yap for any period of time.
I like that. I also like when authors are willing to talk about their books because I have noticed, I mean, you and I come from a slightly different form of journalism, and I have noticed that sometimes it's harder to get authors to want to dig into like the details per se. Like they put their story out, which is totally fair, and then they don't want to talk about like the whys and hows and whatever. They just want to leave it to the audience. And again, I think it's totally fair, but like there's a little piece of it missing for me in the discourse. So I'm really glad that you wanted to do this. And so I always ask people to start with their past pop culture influence. And for you, I know it was one that you talk about in pretty detailed ways in your book. I don't want you to feel like you have to repeat anything, but I do want you to just start by setting up a little bit about when you first came to this movie. Just heads up, everybody, it's Forrest Gump. So we were both very young when we saw it, which may explain a few things about how we talk about it. But set up a little bit about how you first came to this movie and what it was that made it an influence in that first moment when you first saw it. And then we'll get into like the more ongoing ways that it may influence you.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up as a disabled person. I grew up as a disabled person as if I left. I am a disabled person. And I grew up as the only disabled person in my family, the only disabled person that I knew for a really long time. So I didn't really have any other examples of what that looked like for me. And movies really were the de facto place that I could see something that was reminiscent of disability. And it was usually something that scared the living crap out of me. Like the Munchkins in The Wizard of
Right.
Oz. The Little Mermaid, I think, was the closest thing that I saw as a small child to being like, oh, okay, she's hampered by a tail. I am hampered by my, inability to walk. So like, friend.
Sure, yeah. Which I also, by the way, had never really thought of before until I read that part of your book. And I thought that was really interesting because so many people talk about the Little Mermaid as like, oh, she's changing herself for this guy. And it's like
Yeah.
she's not. If you're really paying attention, before she like even really knew who he was, she was longing for something different. And
Sure,
you
sure.
attach, you connecting like a disability, I connected it to like, well, I lived in New York and didn't want to be there. So like wanting to be somewhere else, like you kind of projected onto it, I think, something different.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think anybody that says, Ariel trades her voice for a pair of legs, sure, that's a valid critique.
Right.
It's also just as messy as my critique of The Little Mermaid, which is that she trades her disability, her tail, for a
Hmm.
pair of legs, and the movie
Hmm.
ends with the ableds, falling
Yes.
in love. So I'm like, it's messy no matter how you slice it. But,
Yes.
when you're a small child that's kind of looking for something to gravitate towards, the chick with the tails is the closest that I was going to get. But my parents were very open with what movies I could watch. They
Okay.
understood that I knew the difference between fantasy and reality. So they kind of let me watch whatever. And so I watched Forrest Gump when it came out in 94,
Yeah.
probably when I shouldn't have. I think, I was very, very small, but I had never seen a wheelchair
Mm.
other than my own, so for me to like see this angry grizzled war vet, in a wheelchair, I was just like, oh, there are other people. There are other people that do this, that have like a disability, where they don't have legs at all. It really opened my eyes to actually seeing something that was not something I had to kind of make a conjecture towards, like,
Mm.
oh, it's kind of like me. It was like, no, this is like me. Mind you, I didn't know that, there's still a vast world of difference, but
Well, sure. I was going to say because he becomes disabled because of
yes,
his work in Vietnam. And
yeah,
that is something I thought was very interesting when you said Forrest Gump and you specifically said Lieutenant Dan, because I think the story is pretty different. I didn't grow up disabled, so I don't want to speak for you.
sure.
But I mean, I feel like you have to feel different if you've grown up that way versus if
Yeah.
you become that.
Well, and I mean, I talk about that a lot in the book.
Right.
It's a deliberate choice by filmmakers to showcase disability as something that happens to you, that you are not inherently born with. So, usually when filmmakers do it, it's so that they can emphasize the key tenet of disability in film, which is that it's something to mourn. It's a story of loss. And in Lieutenant Dan's case, it certainly is. He's an able-bodied man that is struck down by disability and has to learn to cope with it. And that's a very deliberate choice a lot of filmmakers make. They're still making that choice
Right.
today because there is this inherent belief that you, as an able-bodied viewer, are not going to understand me.
Mm.
That disabled people are such a mysterious entity that you need I call it the able-bodied buffer. You need that character that is kind of akin to guide you through. You
I would
know,
like to just say that I don't agree that we need it.
no,
And I
no,
know you're not
no.
advocating for it and saying we
No, and
need it. You're
I
saying
say,
filmmakers think that. But
it
yeah,
treats audiences like they're stupid,
yeah.
and I think that that's really unfortunate, and you don't see this with, it's kind of akin to the white savior, where you have the white person that has to help usher you in through,
Hmm.
racism.
Hmm.
But it's something that is, once you start to notice it in disabled films, it is omnipresent.
Hmm.
And I've had people ask me before, well, you talk about Lieutenant Dan a lot, but you never talk about Forrest Gump. You didn't identify with Forrest Gump as a disabled man? And I say no.
Right.
I didn't grow up with a mental disability.
Right.
And I think the fact that he is always ambulatory throughout the whole movie, he has the leg
I
braces,
was just, yeah.
which he literally breaks the shackles of at,
Right.
the
Which
beginning of the movie.
also, I will just speak for myself. When I first saw Forrest Gump, I didn't believe any of the story because he's
Sure.
narrating the story and he's unreliable for a lot of reasons. And just that scene where the shackles, literally, the braces literally break the way that you just
Yeah.
said, releasing
It's supposed
shackles
to be, I've heard
feels
people argue,
fantasy.
it's supposed to be a tall tale. It's
Yes.
supposed to be a
That's a
tale.
nicer way of saying it.
Yes. And I think too, again, because mental disabilities also played very deliberately
Hmm.
in film, I think the fact that Forrest Gump, for me, aside from the low IQ, okay, he's not going to be, a mathlete anytime soon.
Hmm.
For the most part, his mental disabilities don't affect, okay, he
Right.
doesn't get to go to school, with the rest of the kids. That's really the only detriment. Forrest is freaking lucky throughout
Yeah.
the entire, he's generationally wealthy. He still goes to war. He's still drafted into service. There's no perk for him of having
Yeah.
this disability. And if anything, he's of use. He benefits personally and through his friends. And even Lieutenant Dan benefits from knowing him. He invests in
Right.
Apple and
Well,
like,
I mean, but that's what's so interesting is because it takes Lieutenant Dan a little bit to come around and say, like, thank you for saving my life. Like, he
yeah,
is obviously, very, as you said, he's mourning, but he is very angry about the fact that he is now in a wheelchair, which I do think is a fair story to tell.
it
But I
is.
don't think, I think where we get problematic is when, like, that's the only story films are
It
telling, which
is.
I mean, I can't say that it's Forrest Gump's fault, but it is one of the ones where it's like, well, he was a person who had an able body and then he became disabled and like couldn't let go of the life that he quote unquote should have had, which
Yeah.
I, as an able-bodied person, do understand.
I
But I
think,
think then, like, well, what we have to also tell the story of the person who isn't, who isn't angry, who isn't upset, who like can still see a full life with disability.
there's a part in Forrest Gump that always strikes me, and it's in the immediate aftermath of Lieutenant Dan losing his legs. And, he pulls Forrest out of bed late at night and tells him, about what he should have died in the field with honor, which you understand that is a huge thing. To go back to 1946 with Harold Russell, who was a soldier
Hmm.
who was a double amputee with his arms and ended up doing the best years of our lives and won 2 Oscars. He felt a lot of shame at the fact that he was not injured in combat. But then that sequence in Forrest Gump, he says to Forrest, have you ever known what it's been like not to have be able to use your legs?
Right.
And Forrest responds with, "Yes, I do." And I always like get really triggered watching that
Yeah.
moment because I'm like,
You
actually, my
don't.
friend, you don't. There is a world of difference between having your legs confined and still being ambulatory, still being able to walk, and not having the use of an appendage at all,
Mm.
and having those appendages actually be excised from you. I have my legs. I would never say like you and I, sir, are in the same boat. I
Right.
don't know. I know what it's like not to walk. Yes. But so I feel like these are little things that to a disabled viewer, you're just
Yeah.
like, no. But at the same time, Lieutenant Dan is a character that, gets to be sexual. We see him, mind you, he's exclusively using sex workers, but he does have, sex. There's a great scene that I always talk about that I love where he talks about talking to a priest, and the
Mm.
priest tells him, "One day you'll be able to walk beside the Lord in the kingdom of heaven." He gets really indignant about that. And as somebody
Yeah.
who has been told personally by well-meaning religious folk about what once I die, all everything will be fine. I'm just kind of like, that's not what we want. Thank you.
Right.
Um, so there are moments where I feel really seen, but at the end of
That's
the
okay.
day, Lieutenant Dan begins and ends in the frame. He's like
Yeah.
a Ken, he only exists in Forrest gaze.
Right.
We don't know what his living situation. We know he's living in
Mm.
a hotel. He says on the government tit at one point. We don't really know anything though about like once he hooks up with Forrest working on the shrimp boat, does he have an apartment? Does he have a car? What does he do? We don't know what he does with his life. He's
Right.
gone for large swaths of the back half of the film and then magically returns with an Asian wife, which I was just like,
That's another.
it's another problematic
Yep.
element. And what Forrest calls magic legs, which are tight. He has titanium
Hmm.
prosthesis, which I was like, well, thank God for that Apple money because that is not standard issue. Your insurance is not going to cover that.
Right. But none of these are things that you could have been know that you could have known or maybe even thinking about
No.
when you were younger
When I
watching
was
this
young,
movie.
no. And I think that what I appreciated as a child, as a small child that should never have been watching this movie, is the fact that I was like, somebody else understands what it's like to be frustrated, who understands what it's like to have to, be angry about everything, and somebody else that knows what it's like to navigate a wheelchair through the busy streets of New York. I didn't live in New York.
But
I've
still,
discovered New York is not exactly the most wheelchair friendly
no,
city.
no, no.
And I think just being able to see another wheelchair user was
Mm.
such a big deal, somebody else that understood how to move, of course I was like, well, why doesn't his wheelchair look like mine? Why does it look like a big janky hospital chair?
Oh
That's a
yeah.
very, very common thing, just plop somebody in something with no back support that they have to sit in full time. But it really did kind of set this tone that was like, oh, okay, there's other wheelchair users out there. I just haven't found them yet. But if there's one and there's a movie, I was like, there's a guy that they put on screen? Like, what is this? This is amazing.
But you do bring up a really good point because you're talking about the fact that he's not the central character. So once you do see this first, I'm going to say first experience of someone who you're relating to on screen who's not centered in the story. Again, we do need to say for the audience, like this was the 90s, so some things were not as easily accessible as they are now in terms of finding media that was old or new. But where I'm going with this is just like what that did, how that opened it up for you in terms of like seeking out other stories like his or other stories like yours, and what you kind of found was common. and I'm sure common enough to then write eventually years later write this book, but also I would imagine common enough for you to realize like, oh, we're not a monolith. Like it's
Yeah.
this guy, he became disabled after the war. He's angry about it. Are all the stories like his, or what do I have as my options?
Yeah, so I mean, after seeing this, I didn't really seek anything out. I
Okay.
just kind of took what was presented. And if I saw a wheelchair, I was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." If I saw somebody that was disabled, I'd be like, "Oh, okay." There's something about Mary, I think, was the next real kind of moment where I was like, "Oh, that person's disabled."
Well,
And yeah, we went through some options here.
oh no, I didn't mean that. The face I made for anyone not watching on YouTube, it was more because in that story, it's not a great depiction either.
It's
One
not, no.
pretending to be disabled.
And I think for me, I remember going to see that again at an age that was grossly inappropriate to actually have seen the movie. I think 11. People were horrified that I was laughing, that I was
Mm,
finding it funny. Like I was not supposed to find this character to be humorous. But I knew, even though, it wouldn't be until years later, my best friend has cerebral palsy,
mhm.
and I just knew that it was exaggerated. I knew
Yeah,
it was fake. And so when the reveal at the end of Something About Mary is that the character has been faking this, I was like, yeah,
yeah.
duh, did nobody else know this? Like that's
Yeah,
why
there's a
it's
very thin
hilarious.
line between like that person's a bad actor and this is
Yeah.
fake the whole time. Yeah.
And so I started to realize like, okay, I'm coming at this from a totally different way, and people are, the audience watching this movie with me is more offended that I find this to be funny. Why is that? Why are they offended? Like, why do they feel I should be offended? Is it
Mm.
because as a disabled person, I shouldn't find something humor? Like, there should be nothing funny about my life? Like, my life is hilarious, let me tell you. And then when I talk about it in the intro in the
Mhm.
book. Once middle school, or I think whatever 2002 was,
Mhm.
2000, when Unbreakable comes out,
Yeah.
um, that's when I started to realize like, oh, people actually see movies as a means of like learning about something, and
Yeah. I mean, it's
that
not always a good thing.
it's not a good. And I'm like, when the representation is bad, it really becomes a problem because I couldn't escape that movie when it came out. People went and saw it and then they saw me and they were like, "Hey, I know you have brittle bone disease. Have you seen Unbreakable? Have you seen Samuel L. Jackson? You would understand it. This is the movie for you." And I was like, "Why?
Right.
Why is this the movie for me? I don't have any connection to it's a comic book movie. Like
Right.
that was before comic book movies were ubiquitous. It was just like, why would I care?" And I started to realize like, oh, you guys are seeing this character and you think that we're the same.
Right. I was just gonna say, like, you're the only person they probably know with this disease, and
Yeah,
he has this disease, and it's very like there were a lot of jokes in sitcoms in the early 2000s about like, oh, you're gay, I'll set you up with my friend who's also gay. It's like that's the
right,
only thing you
right.
have in common. You probably are not going to care about this other person. And similarly here, I would argue like that's also not the main part of the story. So
Yeah,
like if
yeah,
you're not interested in comics or like the main part of the story, it feels like a leap. It feels like a well-meaning leap, but also
yeah.
still just like it's proving like we don't really know a lot about what you're going through. We're just trying to like force a connection.
Yeah, when that happened a lot to me, as a kid, is that people would see me, in my wheelchair, and they'd be like, "Have you seen my left foot?
Oh
Like, I
no.
feel like you would benefit from it." There was always a movie in somebody's back pocket where
Right.
they were like, "I feel like you would get benefit from this," and I was like, so for
Were there
me.
ever any where you agreed or someone did? No, I'm saying like in all honesty, like was there ever a movie where someone said it, you maybe hadn't heard of it, and then you saw it, and maybe not for the reasons that they were expecting, but you did really connect or enjoy the movie?
Ooh, it's tough to think of back then, if anybody really, recommended anything that I genuinely cared about.
Okay.
I'm sure once
That's
once
fair.
we
It's just
end
every
this
once in a
call,
while,
like,
sometimes something will stick. And again,
yeah,
not necessarily for the reasons that they think. Not
Yeah.
like, oh, he's in a wheelchair, so are you, enjoy. But it's more of
Exactly.
like, oh,
I
there's a
mean,
story here that's interesting.
weirdly enough, I had a lot of people tell me, like Mac and Me was the big one when that came out. And I
Okay.
didn't see Mac and Me until years later. And I know everybody talks about that movie in the context of like Paul Rudd or the aliens and how ridiculous it is. But I mean, to watch that and to see an actual actor with spina bifida
Mm,
move in the frame. I was like, oh, actually, people should be telling people to watch Mac and Me, if only because, like, it's actually an authentically cast story. So you get to see a real kid engage in hijinks, and move through the frame as a disabled character. And his disability is not the center of the story. It's this
true.
cuckoo bananas tale about,
Yeah.
like,
It's like an
aliens
ET.
and
Yeah.
immigration. It's so I think it wasn't until I started, as a journalist, I didn't want to write about disability. I didn't think
Right.
there's anything interesting about me being disabled. And then when I started to write about it and saw people, who were disabled, who were like, finally, someone understands the issue. And more importantly, people that were not disabled that were like, oh my God, this is actually horribly offensive. Like,
Mm,
am I a horrible person? I'm like, no, it's just now like
right.
what it is. But once I started noticing kind of the themes, I'd always joked about the able-bodied buffer to my friends,
Yeah.
and I was like, I'd always kind of brought up like, that's. You ever notice how like all disabled people are like white dudes? Like, have you ever noticed that?
I mean,
That's
that's a
kind
whole, but that's also a whole other layer of like how long it's taken the industry to
yeah.
allow people of color to do anything important on TV or in
And
movies
it's
too.
still, I mean, it's still, Annenberg just did their study
Yeah.
from last year. They just put it out a couple weeks ago, and the stats have not moved since 2015. It's still 70% white male
Yeah.
with disability. We're still not seeing enough women. We're still not seeing enough women of color or any people of color with disabilities. When Tessa Thompson was in Creed, and she's a woman who's playing a character that's deaf, I'm like, that is skewing the numbers because we do not have enough black women with disabilities in these movies. And I think now that I'm an adult, and I talk about in the book, how movies made me feel as a
Right.
disabled teenage girl, I it makes me nervous. I like it keeps me up at night
Yeah.
wondering like where are the young disabled girls, and the disabled girls of color,
Yeah.
you know, what are they doing? What are they watching? Because there's a couple additional things, but I don't know if they feel any better about themselves than I
Right.
did in the 90s.
Right. Which, I mean, you already brought up the fact that like you weren't intending to set out kind of putting yourself in your journalism and then have kind of had to in a lot of ways. I want to talk a little bit about that process for you to get comfortable with that, both in journalism and articles, certainly, but then also in these books, because there is, I think a lot of ways someone could write a book like Popcorn Disabilities, and it could, like, if I were to write it, it would be strictly from an academic point of view, but
Sure.
I wouldn't know if I'm doing it the right justice because I haven't lived through the experiences. And I
Yeah.
think you do a really great job of like saying up front, this is my experience. So I'm going to talk about other things in this book that are not my experience. And I'm not, going to speak for other people, but I'm going to still bring it up because it's important, like deafness being one of them. But I am curious about like what it was that finally tipped you over to the point of saying like, yeah, I'm okay to put myself in this story.
It's hard and it's something I still deal with. I mean, I have a master's in English. So I remember English 101, I statements. Nobody likes I statements. Do not put I think in your work. So it's very
I
hard
do
for
think
me.
there's like a time and a place,
It's
certainly in like certain types of features and opinion pieces. And like
yeah.
even in reviews, I argue sometimes, it's fine. Like that. And that's, I think, what I really meant too is like
Yeah.
kind of maybe not just for yourself, but also the publications that you work with, like kind of
Yeah,
figuring out when to do it and when not to do it.
it's tough, and writing this book, I finally realized like if I'm going to get this book done, like I'm going to have to break that fourth wall, and just kind of start giving my own perspective. And it's also hard. I'm a Virgo and an eldest daughter, so I always say like I'm not an expert. I'm not a when did I become the expert? Like I don't have a PhD. So I very much undermine myself.
Yeah,
Um,
I was gonna say I don't even think it's about I don't even know what it being a true expert is anymore. Like if you're willing
right?
to do the research, like that's the most important thing. You're willing to like say this is what this is. This is why this is important. You're backing it up with facts and then you're also saying
Yeah.
like and this is my experience. Like that to me you're making yourself an expert.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, when I started writing, I wrote about disability because I was like, okay, what's something I can write quickly that I
Mm,
know like the back of my hand? Money would be great. And I was like, this is something I know I can, turn over really quickly.
right.
But once I started doing more and more writing, I was kind of like, I don't want to get pigeonholed. And it was very
Mm,
easy, in some of the workplaces that I worked at for somebody to be like, well, Kristen, you're disabled. You can write about this. You can
yeah.
write about that. And then that leads down a slippery slope of like, well, Kristen, you know about being marginalized. You can write about, the race in pop culture. I'm
Oh,
like,
sure.
actually, no, I can't. It's not something I should be doing. With this book, I knew I was like, of course, I'm not a person that struggles with. I have a lot of white privilege, but I'm like, but it would be unfair of me not to include a discussion about being
Hmm.
a person of color and disabled, and talking about the few characters that exist. I don't have a mental disability, but I have to talk about how mental disability is portrayed in film. So when it comes to my writing, my whole thing always is like disabled people do not have the same experience, but we have analogous experiences to other communities. The history of LGBTQ representation in film is vastly different,
Yeah.
but they do share commonalities in terms of bad representation, lack of authentic casting, and all of this stuff. So I always couch it as like these, I would never say one person's struggle is worse or better. But the fact that Hollywood unfortunately prioritizes stories about certain
Mm,
people does make it hard for, people that don't have that, so I always couch disability when I talk about it in terms of ambulatory versus non-ambulatory.
yeah.
And an ambulatory person has a different set of struggles than somebody like me. You look at a step, that person who is ambulatory can maybe go over that step. I, as a wheelchair user, cannot. Therefore, I have more struggles to get rights,
Yeah.
because people love stairs, unfortunately, even though it benefits everybody. So I think it's really about teaching people, that the struggles are the same, yet people have harder issues because society has made it that way,
Hmm.
So and it's the same in film. You may be watching a story about a white guy who's, struggling to be accepted, but he has a far easier opportunity and better chances of ending the movie, being accepted, and getting laid than a movie about a disabled woman who may also be white, but movies have set up this idea that disabled women are only seen through their aesthetics. So if you're not a hot disabled girl
Hmm.
who can pass for able-bodied, you're deaf that your story's not even getting told if you don't look
Yeah.
like that. So I think that, movies really do set a bad precedent in emphasizing that, we are in competition with each other,
Mm.
in a lot of ways. And it shouldn't be that way because we're all striving for the same thing, which is acceptance. Yet movies are saying like, yeah, but we only want certain people
Right.
to tell these movies about.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Just like the fact of whose stories are even being told and
Right.
who's telling them.
Yeah.
Because, all the examples that we're really talking about, we're not talking about actual disabled actors playing these roles. And I think for a long time that was kind of because there weren't people who were disabled getting the chances to rise to the level to star in a movie. And I would still argue that's true.
It
But I
is.
would also
Yeah.
argue like no one even thought that that was an option at a certain point. And it was only when people started complaining that people started to pay more attention and to say, all right, well, at least audition.
Yeah.
Like I love Tessa Thompson. Is she the only deaf black? She's not deaf in real life. So is she the only black actress who could have played a deaf black woman? No?
It's tough. I get, being a journalist, I get a lot of pushback, sometimes when I bring up ableism and inauthentic casting in film, but by filmmakers.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah,
had
of
more
course.
than my fair share of
And listen,
filmmakers.
I also do want
Yeah,
to say that like if she's the best person for it,
sure.
great. But
You
I
know,
mean, what I'm worried about is that like there are black actors out there who are deaf who are not even being considered for these
if the
parts.
playing field were level, it would not be a problem. The problem is
Right.
the playing field is not level.
Right.
And so there's certainly an ability to criticize inauthentic casting. I say all the time, casting's easy. It is so easy, you would think that creatives would just do it so that we would shut up about it. Because the hardest part for me at this point, I'm like, I don't care about casting. Casting is the floor.
Mm,
I want to see more disabled directors, screenwriters,
yeah.
craft services, costume designers. The problem though is if we can't even get cast to play these roles, we sure
Yes.
as hell are not going to get those other opportunities. And that's I think the big thing. I've had a lot of creatives try to explain to me, justify why they've done certain things, why they've made certain decisions, and I'm like, that's fine. But who
Right.
are you hiring
Yeah.
to cover up to balance those scales? There are creatives that I love where I'm just like, okay, cool. Now that it's a problem. What are you doing going forward using your privilege, using your allyship to balance those scales? And a lot of people, unfortunately, are not doing that.
Right.
So I think that's the bigger problem for me. 1 in 4 has a disability. That means 3 and 4 don't.
Right.
And they outnumber us. So, we need allies using that privilege. I say all the time, a big creative, I mean, Steven Spielberg, if he wants to put a disabled person in a lead role, he can do that. He
Hmm.
can say, I'm going to put this person, never acted before in their lives.
Yeah.
They're going to be the star of this movie. And he would be able to do
But that
that.
also then implies that he has a script that he can do authentically, even not
Sure.
being
Well,
a disabled
I mean,
person himself.
I don't even think disability has to be the story. If he wanted to make
That's true. Yeah.
something, that just is about teens, if
Yeah.
his UFO movie, I don't know what it's about, no one does, but why not put a disabled character and see how that works? He could definitely do it.
Right.
He does not, and I think that that's the bigger frustration that I have is that there are people that can utilize that privilege. I love Sebastian Stan. I love what he did at the Golden Globes talking about we need to tell these stories.
Right.
What is Sebastian Stan going to do now that he knows this? How can he use his privilege to make sure that there are disabled people working on his films or in his orbit? I think that's the next big step, that I would love to see as opposed to, a creative calling me and being like, you don't understand why I made this
Oh,
decision. And I'm like, I do understand why you made the
right.
decision, but you know that now it's offensive. How are you going to do better next film? I think is
Right.
the big thing. We're at this real point where there's so much awareness, there's so much acknowledgement,
Mm,
and yet creatives still feel that awareness and acknowledgement is as good as it's
mm.
as good as. I love Barbie. I think Barbie's great, but could Greta Gerwig have maybe, I don't know, given the dancing Barbie in a wheelchair a
Some
character
lines.
name? Some lines, some something, I'm glad there are disabled people in Barbie land with, disabilities,
Yeah.
but that's where the buck stops. And
Yeah.
I need more. It's not enough to just have us in the frame. You need to
Right.
give us stories.
Right. Now, you talk about in your book a movie from, I believe, and I'm good, I might get this year wrong. You can correct me. 1932,
Mhm.
Freaks,
Yeah,
that you mentioned has the most representation on screen to this day.
yeah,
And so like that is part of like everything you're talking about right now, like that was echoing in the back of my mind as you were talking about it. Like 1932 is almost 100 years ago. And granted, we're not going to say that the story didn't have problems of its own because
sure.
of the time period it was made in and the way that these characters were portrayed as like the old school freak show, and you're kind of a traveling spectacle
Yeah,
is maybe the word I should use. And so that's problematic in its own way, but it still had the most representation almost 100 years later. And I'm
yeah.
I'm curious when you're writing this book and you're realizing that, what if any conclusions you can draw as to like why?
Yeah, I mean, Freaks, and this is an informal poll, but I'm pretty sure it still holds the record for having the most visibly physically disabled performers in one film. I can't, I'm waiting for somebody to be, oh, well, actually, this little known film from something,
But
is
that would be also a very telling thing. This little known film that comes
yeah,
out of the woodwork,
right, right.
talking about like all of these other movies you talk about in your book that have people who are getting nominated or winning Oscars. It's maybe one character, maybe two
One, yeah.
characters. And again, they're not even disabled performers.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like to
So I
be able to, I think you're safe is what I'm trying to say
Exactly. Yeah.
here.
I'm like, I defy anybody to tell me that that's not actually the record.
Right.
But no, I mean, I saw Freaks, in high school, and Freaks made me really uncomfortable the first time I watched it because I had never seen anybody that looked like me
Yeah.
on screen. I don't pass for abled. I'm very small and very compact. My visible disabilities are something that cannot be hidden. And that leads to a lot of I struggle with low self-esteem and body image problems. So to see characters that were unrepentantly more disabled than me, my own internalized ableism just kind of came out, and I was just like, oh my God, this is horrific. And it wasn't until I started realizing, like, oh, that's what society has been telling me
Mm.
I should think about myself. And I started to notice a lot when it comes to the visibly disabled, and that extends to mental disabilities as well. I think people have a line when it comes to how visibly disabled and you can be physically and mentally before an audience is like, oh wait, nope, nope, I'm not cool
Mm.
with that. And so to watch Freaks multiple times, I was like, oh no, this movie's actually revolutionary. This is a community of people who do have disabilities that are just living their life, that are the camera watches them do regular things like eat lunch,
Mhm.
groom themselves. They have children. They get married. They fall in love. It's all of these things where I was just like, oh, okay. So it's not strange. It's not abnormal. The freaks, you could argue are the able-bodied people that treat them
Yeah.
poorly. The villainous character that wants to kill Hans, the little person, and take his money. Um, and to then do more research and find out that MGM, sold it as a horror film
Yep.
and came up with all these potentially apocryphal stories about people, a woman miscarrying because she was so horrified and disgusted. There's horrific stories about people at the MGM commissary refusing to eat with the actors.
Mm.
Supposedly, F. Scott Fitzgerald vomited when seeing the conjoined twin sisters Daisy and Violet Hilton, which I was like, it was F. Scott Fitzgerald. It could have just been 9 a.m. in the morning and he was drunk off his ass. I don't know. I wouldn't blame them. But it's one of the most, I think, is it a horror movie? Sure, the last like 20 minutes maybe, but I think it is one of those movies that really does try to situate what a
Yeah.
community of disabled people looks like, and how they all understand each other's problems and ultimately how they all come together to accept each other. I mean it's really revolutionary, when you look at it like that. And it really did kind of set the tone for me where I was like, "Oh, okay. I'm resistant to it because I've never seen anybody look like me and be cool with it. And these
Mm.
guys look like they look and they are totally cool with it."
So what I find really interesting about that too is, when you were talking earlier about like films being something that people will learn from, right? And so a lot of these movies, freaks aside, because they were born with this, whether they're short in stature or whatever, the conjoined twins, like all of them, I believe, were born with.
Yes.
Yes, okay. But then there are a lot of films you also talk about in your book, like Forrest Gump, where the person becomes disabled, and the story is then talking about like being angry about it, trying to hide it because you don't want to like have to change your life too much, or
There's
like
stories
just
of loss.
yeah, a lot of like inability to cope or willingness to cope and change. And so I am curious if you feel like I don't even know if you feel like you can step back because you didn't have that experience, but like stepping back and looking at films like that, if you feel like they are teaching people certain things at what point is that lesson too much of the same lesson?
Yeah, I mean, I think movies for a long portion of the time have been selling the story about disability as strictly a tale of tragedy, or resilience. We love an inspirational, we love an inspired disabled performance.
Hmm,
We
that's
have
fair.
one coming out this year with the Neil Diamond song Sung Blue, which does have a disabled component to it.
Hmm.
You can read my review about how well that is
Oh
pulled off.
no, that doesn't sound like it's going to be a positive review.
And it's
But
been
that
a
says
minute
a
since I've
lot. I mean, that says a lot. It's 2025 and it's still
yeah,
getting stuff
and I
wrong.
said it's been a minute since I've seen a movie go that old school, of like the shining disabled person that struggles and is horrified and struggles with addiction and loss and all of this and then comes out the other side with a smile on their face and they're able to like accept their lot in life. And it's the story of the underdog. It's why
Yeah,
disabled stories, the sports genre, we love an inspirational, disabled sports story about like a ragtag team of disabled people that like come up from the bottom. In some of those movies, I mean, I get what they're going for. It's essentially the story of like these are the ultimate underdogs, these are the ultimate people that are down and out, and watch
right,
them succeed. I think though that those movies don't emphasize the realities of the situation that a lot of these people are put in. One of the movies that I talk about that I actually really like what it does is David Gordon Green's Stronger
hmm,
with Jake Gyllenhaal, the Boston Marathon
yeah,
movie. And I think what I appreciate about that is that it is a story of loss and it is a story of resilience. But the character was kind of a screw up before the movie starts. You see him as this kind of like Boston goon that's like working at Costco and
right.
doesn't have any direction, very much selfish, and then becomes disabled and is very content to just kind of like be like, well, I'm disabled now. This is what's up. And it's other characters that are being like, no, you were this way before, and now you just are kind of living in this hole, and you need to figure out your own shit, and you
Hmm.
need to be better. And I really appreciated that. And it's also a movie that talks about the character is not wealthy, so you
Yeah,
see him navigate a very small apartment. You see how the press utilizes his story and how he's uncomfortable with it. You see how his family tries to monetize him and how he's uncomfortable with it. So I think that what I appreciated about it a lot, even though Jake Gyllenhaal is not disabled, is that it is a story of resilience, but also saying like these are the realities of the
right.
situation. This is what happens. And this character is forced to adapt, but also understand that, it's other people putting all this stuff on him and also his own baggage, it's his own
Yeah,
baggage that is causing him to see that this is a problem,
right.
So I appreciated that movie for how it kind of played on what we already kind of know are disabled
But that's
stereotypes.
what I find interesting is because that's a true story. It feels like when you're taking that to a new medium, you have more authority as the screenwriter and as the director to be like, we can't lean too far into certain film stereotypes because that's not what happened and we might have pushback. It feels like when you're creating something out of nothing, maybe hopefully this is getting better, but like especially, what I kept thinking of was Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, where
Yeah.
like this woman, she's going blind, she still wants to compete. She tries to hide her blindness, which is so dangerous, but also like kind of speaks to like, well, her spirit, she doesn't want to change her life, she doesn't want to give up this thing that she loves. But I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that's a true story.
I think it is actually.
Oh,
It
well,
is.
then maybe
Yeah.
everything I'm saying is wrong because I was like, there's no way.
But
That
I
feels like
think
a real Hollywood written out moment of like, she's gonna be blind and do this and succeed and whatever.
Well, I think too, Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken ends with her saying, like, I continued to do this for
Yes.
years afterwards. And I was like, where's that story? I want to see that story of her just continuing to do this and
Mm,
being really good at it for as long as she is. But,
mm,
it's a double-edged sword with based on true stories. Again, I think creatives use it as a crutch to be like, well, this is how it was. So if you think it's maudlin
True.
and stereotypical,
Too
well,
bad.
the family's cool with it. I
That is
talk
a good
about
point. Yeah.
I talk about the theory of everything, the Stephen Hawking movie, which is very much this stereotypical, yes, we kind of present Stephen Hawking as a bit of a lout, who belittles his
Yeah.
wife's accomplishments and has a emotional affair with his nurse. But it is really Jane Hawking's story, and they use her book as the basis for everything. And so, for people to criticize, there was a lot of pushback by being like, well, this is based on facts. This is
Yeah.
based on facts. The Neil Diamond, book,
Yes.
I've already gotten comments from people being like, well, this is based on true events.
That's
This
true.
really happened. And I think that that is a way to kind of get around
Mm.
disabled criticisms. And it's a double-edged sword. It really is. Some of them do well, but I think at the end of the day, if you are, excuse me, an able person, that is taking a true story, you're even more required to find a way to not fall into stereotype. But on the other side of that, we just can also erase things that we don't like. So, when Disney did Christopher Robin in 2018,
Right.
which I had a lot of people tell me it's not an A.A. Milne biopic, so I can't complain about it, but a lot of it is based on A.A. Milne's own life, including the fact that he had a daughter.
Hmm.
And in the movie, the daughter is this precocious little scamp, that runs all around throughout the film. And A.A. Milne did have a daughter who was disabled, was a wheelchair user. But that's not that's I feel like creatives utilize based on a true story when they want to.
Right. Loosely.
So the Iron Claw is another great example. There was actually another Von Erich brother that had what I had. He had osteogenesis imperfecta. And when Sean Durkin was asked during Q&As, why is that character not in the book? He kind of said, well, we didn't want to make it tragedy upon tragedy. We had to condense. That character got blended into another character, and we just kind of went with it. But don't worry, the family's cool with it. And so I feel like it's often kind of, you take artistic liberty when you want
Yeah.
with based on a true story.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to hear the family's cool with it be the refrain too, because
Yeah.
yeah, then you're just kind of passing the buck a little bit of like, I wanted to make this change. And if you're really mad about it, maybe be mad with them because they
Yeah.
basically said okay. They like signed off on it, which
Yeah.
I don't think is totally fair because they're not the people in power making this movie.
Right. And they're not utilizing two, I think which would be a more effective answer to that question, which is like the family's fine with it, but it is their experience. It is
Yes.
strictly their experience. And I think that would go a long way to at least being like, we understand disability is not a monolith, not every
Right.
story is the same. But instead, utilizing like we had the family around and they were fine with all these changes, it pretty much acts as like a band-aid.
Yeah. So you're looking at a lot of movies within this book, like as I said, ones that are almost 100 years old, leading up to as close to, well, not as close to today as we're recording today because you had to turn in your manuscript a little while
Right.
ago, but like very close to, what's happening today. Talk a little bit about that process of like the selection and the, how deep to go, what determined how deep you were going to go with certain types. I don't even know how you did it, I guess, in terms of like, were you trying to parcel them out thematically and be like, over here, I'm gonna go deeper because I have experience, and then over here, I'm gonna just kind of start a conversation. What was your process like to sort through all of this very vast material?
It changed a lot in the writing. I knew there were certain things that I just kind of kept touching on in my writing as a journalist that I wanted to expand on. I figured the easiest way would be chronologically,
Sure.
and then as chronologically fell away, I was like, let's start, kind of lumping stuff into themes. So, the war years, I was like, let's just instead of going it through the 1940s, we'll just lump everything into, war films. We'll talk about gender. So it really started, it was an amorphous process
Okay.
as I was trying to kind of fit everything in. I took suggestions from friends and family that were like, you should include this. I knew I had to, there were certain movies that I had avoided that I knew I had to finally watch,
Okay.
So like I knew I was probably gonna have to watch My Left Foot. I knew I wanted to do, a section on mental disabilities. So I was like, I guess we're finally watching, The Other Sister, and I have to rewatch I
Mm.
Am Sam.
But see, but
So
that's what I find really interesting because it's like I think it can be very easy to just stick to the ones that you feel you know very well. But
yeah.
being able to open up and say like, well, I'm watching this for the first time maybe, or the first time in a long time, to then deep dive in, I think sometimes also gives you maybe not a brand new perspective, but also kind of gives you like, oh, this is fresh. I know exactly where this is going to go. Maybe almost more than something you've been thinking about for so long because you just like want to get that thing so right.
Yeah, yeah, I knew I wanted to do a chapter on Tropic Thunder and the full R word scene.
Yeah,
And I was like, how am I actually going to do that though? Like a full chapter on me talking about Tropic Thunder is not going to work. So I'm like, well, why don't we just talk about mental disabilities and we talk about all the films that are referenced in that speech,
right.
but then add in some other stuff. And it was the chapter I really didn't want to do because again, I was like, I know I'm going to be talking out of my hat, but at the same time, I had been told by so many people over the years that all of these movies were garbage. Like I had been told I Am Sam is awful. I vaguely remembered watching it when it came out, but I had never felt the inclination to see it since. And I had been told that Gary Marshall's The Other Sister was an awful, awful film.
Yeah, I was
Uh,
gonna say, I don't think you're going to be talking out of your hat because you're a film critic, you're a journalist, like you
yeah,
know what makes, even if you don't know what it's like to be a person with that disability watching that movie, you know what it takes to make that movie a quality
right. So
production. And the other thing I would say, and I may get shit for this online, but like I feel like a lot of people with the disabilities watching those movies, they don't necessarily know that they have that they like that they're different all the time. So
well,
like
that's the
you are
thing.
probably
Yeah.
almost better qualified to say this is good or not. They are more qualified to
Yeah.
say this is my experience or not. But I mean, I think a lot of times they might not, I would hope they don't feel completely othered and like,
I couched everything for that section in like, you know, we have analogous issues, in terms of lack of representation, lack of respect, all of these things. And I think too, I'm also talking about movies that I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty. I would never
sure,
say I know what an authentic
sure.
autistic performance is. But I can watch Rain Man and I know that, the history of Rain Man is that it's perpetuated this belief that people with autism are really great at math, and that they're all savants of some
Yes.
of some stripe,
It's
you
before
know.
we knew the word spectrum, apparently. Like
Exactly.
some people might be on that end of the
Sure.
spectrum, yes, but not
Yes.
everybody. We're
Not
not the
everybody.
same.
Watching The Other Sister, as somebody that does not have those disabilities, I connected and was like, actually, it's not that this movie is bad. It's that people decided the movie was bad because they saw Juliette. My theory is that they
Mm.
saw Juliette Lewis playing this disabled character who is mentally disabled. They didn't think she was hot,
Oh,
and they just all decided it was offensive. It's offensive. We know that it's not appropriate for people to, play these types of roles. So we've all just kind of sold this theory that the movie is bad.
interesting.
And I put in the book, I'm all, people watching this movie, it comes out a couple years after, I think 3 or 4 years after Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
I'm like,
If you're
audiences
trying
watching
to
I'm like,
compare.
audiences watching this are going to be like, this is Mallory Knox. This is not what I want. I don't want this, And yet the movie is, I think, one of the few to really look at a disabled woman that wants to be independent, wants to have a job, is a sexual being, wants to get married, and is being told by her family, like, no, your job is going to be staying in this house
Right.
until you die. It's a very authentic film. And I was like, I'm like, I collectively just think people all decided, they're being
Hmm.
good allies. They're being good allies. See,
Hmm.
we know this movie's not good, so we're not seeing it because we know it's offensive. But yet that I'm like, if we can't get authentic stories about the mentally disabled because they're uncomfortable for an abled audience to watch, then how do we do those stories?
Yeah. I mean, I
It's
also think that's kind of like who's deciding they're uncomfortable for us to watch, you
yeah,
know? I mean, like, yeah, sometimes there will be moments that are in any movie, there are moments that are uncomfortable. Like, it's uncomfortable for me to think about someone basically being held prisoner by their family. But like that, I will say I do think that was happening and might still be happening for a lot of people who like conservatorship or however we want to
yeah,
say it, like they don't feel that they're ready. They're infants, they're keeping them like infants
yeah,
in a way. And so like that to me is what is harder to watch because you know like that shouldn't be happening.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
people with their own minds
I
and
think certain movies really do require the audience to kind of rewire their thinking about what is considered a disabled story. And I'm usually the little rain cloud that's kind of like showing up to be like, actually, that movie's ridiculously offensive. I still hear people all the time when I talk about disability, they're like, "Have you seen Million Dollar Baby? Isn't Million Dollar
oh
Baby great?" And I'm like, I know we
I absolutely understand what you
like
wrote. I was one of the people that did really enjoy Million Dollar Baby, but I do understand what you wrote. I think I came at it more from the idea of if I were in her shoes and that
Sure.
happened to me, I would want to be put out of my misery too. You know what
But
I
I
mean?
mean,
And like that's not everyone's story. And so like I think
no,
it's
and
dangerous to say that's everyone's story, but
you'd
like
be responding to the immediate, and I think a lot of people, I've heard from people with spinal cord injuries that say, in the immediate,
yeah, the depression that comes
days and
after.
weeks, yeah, of course everybody goes through that. They're like, but then, you do a couple months of therapy and you start rehab and
Sure. I
all,
think for me, for her, because her life was so bad outside
and
of
that's
that,
exactly why
it's
they set it
everything.
up.
It's like
Yeah.
you can't do the thing you love anymore, and your life is bad outside of that. I understand the like,
Yeah.
just don't I don't want to be here anymore. But I will also say, like, I have a very specific DNR, and this is very specific to me. And again, I don't think that my story or my way of thinking about these things should be every movie because I do think that's an unfair precedent to be like all disabilities mean end of quality of life. That's not
Yeah.
true.
No, no, and I say out in the intro, my goal with the book is to not judge anybody for loving Million Dollar Baby or loving Forrest
Yeah.
Gump. I love movies that are problematic all the time. My hope is that people reading the book who are able will look at movies a little bit closer and be like, huh, okay, so this character is a white
Yeah.
man. He is disabled later in life. Like, why are we utilizing this for this story? I always joke that like the book is going to tell you how movies are selling you a bill of goods about,
Yeah.
disabled people. But I mean, my whole thing, with the way the world is going, disability comes with age. So eventually,
That's true. Yeah.
most people will experience disability. And long COVID, unfortunately, is
It's,
only kind of hastening that. And I think my issue is that there are so many people that have watched movies about disability, and when that happens to them, they're just like, my life is over. Like, what do I do? And
yeah.
I think when you look at the fact that we have, Canada has the euthanasia
Yes.
protocol made in there. They've talked about it in certain states being something to bring to the US.
Hmm.
And I do think movies have a hand, unfortunately, in perpetuating this idea that to be disabled means you should not want to live.
Yeah.
Essentially, once that happens, send me out through the quietus, if you've seen Children of Men.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, and but to be honest, like that's what I would hope your book would stir in conversation. Like,
Yeah,
watch these movies and then talk about those things. Like, do you feel that way? If you do, why? And
yeah.
like, can you get past that? You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
I had not even 3 months ago, I was in line at a movie theater, and there was a woman who, was staring at me, and I was just like, what are we doing here? And she was just like, I've been in a wheelchair before. I
Oh wow.
understand your struggle.
Oh.
And I was like, cool, that's cool. And she's like, how long have you been in a wheelchair? And I was like, my most since I was 5 years old. And
Yeah.
she's like, I'm sorry, will it get better? And I was just like, why are you sorry? Why are you
Yeah.
sorry?
But
And
that's
she's
but
like,
that's because we've been taught or
exactly. And
trained.
I was like, this
Yeah.
interaction right here, you shouldn't have to tell somebody, and she was very upset that she like brought it up, and I've had people I've interviewed for work, when they find out I'm disabled, be like, "Are you in pain? Is your life
Yes.
painful?" And I'm like, "No, but it's because movies have been telling you this for years, and it's not." And so I think, the hope is that people will read this, especially as, disability is becoming more of a thing, even
Yeah.
though rights are getting eroded left and right. But, disability is still something that everybody's going to deal with, and I would hope that there will be less people who will feel that it's a death sentence,
Right.
than before. That's the hope, at least. Somebody like me telling them, like, movies are kind of lying to you, as you should know. Movies sell fantasy. But when it comes to disability, and there are there are movies that I love.
Mhm.
I think Coming Home from 1978 is a
Yeah.
great example of disability representation, even though it does not have a disabled actor. Sound of Metal, I think, is really
Hmm.
great. There are movies that are emphasizing that it's life, and it's something you cope with, and it doesn't have to be, something you want to throw yourself in front of a bus over,
Right.
which would be my hope.
Right, right. So speaking of, I always like to ask, where do you want people to find this book? Because I always like to tell people where to get the things that we've discussed. There are lots of places to get books. Is there one that you want to direct them to specifically?
It's a book about disability in 2025. I feel like anybody buying it anywhere is a good thing right now. But I always say, books are expensive. I love books. I never have enough money for books. So I always say if you can recommend it through your library, that's always a good thing. Let more people have
Yeah,
access to it. So if it's not at your local library or through Libby or Overload or whatever, please, let people know at your library that you want to read it.
that is very nice because I was like, I don't know how residuals work through libraries. So like that
I
is very
don't
nice of
either,
you.
but I pretty much decided residuals. What are those? So
Fair.
any
Okay.
way people have access to it, I'm cool with. And there is going to be an audiobook for my low-sighted friends.
Are you reading it?
No,
Oh,
they didn't have time to do that. But I'm just happy that there is an audiobook
right.
that is coming, because there was a question of whether that was going to be a thing. So there is an audiobook that's going to be out day and date for people who want to read it that way.
I was going to say for a book about disabilities, it would have been
That
a
would have been
big
a bad
misstep
thing.
upon the publisher's part to not
Yeah,
have the accessibility option.
yeah.
Okay, I do want to also highlight the film. So Forrest Gump was the main one available to rent, not stream, on Apple TV and Prime Video currently. I do also want to call your attention to two other films that we talked about in a little bit more detail than usual. Freaks, the 1932 film. I was surprised it was so easily accessible, but it is available on HBO Max. And then Stronger is available to stream on Prime Video. So once again, thank you to Kristen for joining us today. Thank you to all of you for listening and or watching. I hope you'll join us again next week for Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. Next week is the episode that I teased about a month ago. It is our Welcome to Derry Deeper Dive.